had been humiliated when he went in to buy a simple watch for his wife. Eli, knowing that something needed to be done, decided to go undercover. He had a plan. He would visit Greg's store, dress the part, and see firsthand how the owner treated people like him. He had no intention of buying anything expensive, but he hoped to expose Greg for what he was. A man who believed that money gave him the right to treat others poorly. It was not an easy decision. Eli knew that his community didn't interact much with the outside world. The plain clothing, the simple ways, they weren't designed for the flashy, materialistic world that existed just beyond the farm. But Eli believed in standing up for what was right. If it meant putting himself in an uncomfortable situation to reveal the truth, then that was a small price to pay. His journey to the store was long and tiring, but when he finally arrived, his heart raced with anticipation. The moment he entered the store, everything seemed to freeze. People stared at him as if he were an alien from another world. Eli didn't mind the stares. He had faced judgment his whole life. This was nothing new. What mattered now was getting Greg to reveal his true nature. As Eli wandered through the aisles, he noticed the way people treated him. The salespeople, who had been so polite to the other customers, barely looked him in the eye. One of them even stepped back when he reached for a pair of gloves, as if afraid that he might soil them with his touch. Greg, who had been watching from behind the counter, finally approached him. Eli could tell that the owner's calm demeanor was a mask. Underneath, Greg was seething with disdain. "Can I help you, sir?" Greg asked, though his tone suggested that he had no intention of offering any real help. Eli nodded. "I'm looking for something for my wife," he said quietly, trying to keep his voice steady. "A gift." Greg eyed him up and down, his expression growing colder. "I think you're in the wrong place. We cater to a different type of customer here. You're not welcome." Eli felt a twinge of anger, but he swallowed it. He had expected this. He wasn't here to argue. He was here to expose the truth. "I would like to buy something," Eli said again, his voice calm. Greg's lips curled into a sneer. "I'm not going to repeat myself. Now." And that was when it happened. Greg moved toward him, his face red with rage, and with one final push he shouted, "Get out of my store." Eli didn't flinch. But before he could respond, the door opened and a tall man in a suit walked in, his gaze locking onto Greg. The man's presence immediately shifted the energy in the room. He was someone important, someone who had power. And as Eli glanced at him, he realized that this was no ordinary day. Something was about to change, and it wasn't just about the Amish man getting kicked out of a store. What would happen next? Would Greg's racism finally be called out? Or would he get away with his actions? The tension was thick as everyone waited to see what would unfold next. The moment the tall man in the sharp suit stepped through the door, the entire atmosphere in the store shifted. His presence was commanding, and all eyes immediately turned to him. Even Greg, who had been seething with anger just moments ago, seemed to pause in his tracks, as though he recognized the man's authority. Eli watched quietly, his heart pounding as he wondered what would happen next. Would this man help him, or would he side with the store owner? Either way, Eli was determined to stand his ground. The man, whose name was Charles Donovan, strode forward with purpose. His eyes never left Greg, and his jaw was set in a firm line. He was tall, with graying hair at the temples, and his expression was one of quiet authority. The sharp cut of his suit made him look like someone who didn't tolerate nonsense. He wasn't the kind of person who would stand idly by while someone was mistreated. Greg, caught off guard, straightened his posture and cleared his throat. "Can I help you, sir?" His voice was smooth, but there was a hint of nervousness beneath the surface. Charles didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned his gaze to Eli. There was something in his eyes, a kind of understanding. Then he spoke, his voice calm and steady. "I was watching," he said, addressing Greg but looking directly at the Amish man. "And I don't think that's the way you should treat people, Greg." Greg's face turned an even deeper shade of red, but he didn't back down. "This is my store," he spat, his words sharp and defensive. "I can ask anyone to leave if they're causing a disturbance. And this man doesn't belong here. He's out of place." Charles took a step closer, his eyes narrowing as he regarded Greg. "A store doesn't belong to the person who owns it. It belongs to the people who keep it in business, the people who come to buy, and yes, the people who come with respect." He turned toward Eli. "This man came here with respect, and you've shown him none. I think you owe him an apology." For a long moment, Greg just stood there, fuming. His pride was wounded, and the last thing he wanted was to admit that he had done something wrong. But Charles wasn't giving him an out. He wasn't going to let Greg get away with his behavior. Finally, Greg spoke, his voice low and tight. I don't need to apologize. You should leave. This is my store and I make the rules. Charles didn't blink. You're right, he said calmly. You do make the rules. But the rule should be that every customer, no matter who they are, deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. The tension in the air was thick, as if everyone in the store was holding their breath, waiting to see how Greg would respond. Would he apologize? Would he finally back down? Instead, Greg snapped, I don't have time for this. Before anyone could react, Greg turned on his heel and stormed off toward the back of the store, muttering under his breath. The store was silent once again, the only sound being the soft hum of the air conditioning. Eli stood there, unsure of what to do next. Charles turned to Eli, his face softening. I'm sorry about that, he said gently. I don't know what kind of person Greg thinks he is, but I can assure you, that's not how the majority of people here think. Eli gave a small nod, but he wasn't sure what to say. He had come here for a reason, to show Greg for who he truly was, but now it felt like everything had just hit a wall. What was the point of standing up for what was right if the man in charge refused to listen? Before he could respond, the door of the store opened again and a woman walked in. She was wearing an expensive dress, her heels clicking against the floor as she entered. She had noticed the earlier tension and as she approached the counter, she shot a curious glance at the two men. Is everything all right here? She asked, her voice laced with concern. Charles gave her a reassuring smile. Yes, everything is fine now. But before anyone could say more, Greg reappeared from the back of the store. His face was tight with anger, but his eyes locked onto the woman who had entered. Eli noticed the way Greg's posture shifted, how his entire demeanor changed when he saw her. There was something about her, something that made Greg's mood turn from fiery to smooth. Ah, Karen, Greg said, his tone now oozing with charm. I didn't realize you were here. Please, let me show you our newest collection. Karen, the woman who had just walked in, smiled brightly. Of course, Greg. I've been hearing so much about your latest pieces. Eli's stomach turned. He could see the way Greg treated her, like she was someone special, someone important. But the way he had treated him, an Amish man just trying to buy a gift for his wife, was appalling. Eli's hand clenched into a fist, but he didn't speak. He had to stay calm. He had to stay focused. This wasn't the time for anger. He had a mission, and he wasn't going to let it go unfinished. But as Greg turned to lead Karen to the back, Eli caught a glimpse of something he hadn't noticed before, something that would change everything. The woman's gaze lingered on him for just a second, a strange look in her eyes. It wasn't pity nor was it judgment. It was something else, something Eli couldn't quite place. But he knew one thing for certain. This was far from over. And just as the door closed behind Greg and Karen, Eli felt a sudden icy sense of dread wash over him. Was this the moment when everything would finally fall into place? Or was it the moment when things would spiral out of control? Eli didn't know. But he was about to find out. The tension in the store had hardly settled when Eli felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him again. Greg's sudden shift from anger to charm had left a bitter taste in his mouth, and he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something wasn't right. As the door closed behind Greg and Karen, Eli stood there, his mind racing. He had to stay calm. He had come this far and there was no turning back now. But he couldn't help but wonder, had he made a mistake by coming here? Had he miscalculated the entire situation? Would his plan to expose Greg's racism ever succeed, or would he be swept under the rug just like the countless others Greg had treated poorly? But before he could spiral into doubt, the door of the store opened once again. This time it was a different customer, an older man with silver hair and a gruff expression. He wasn't wearing anything fancy, just a simple jacket and worn shoes, but his demeanor suggested he wasn't someone to be trifled with. Eli turned his head slightly, trying not to draw attention to himself. He was still hoping for a moment of clarity, a chance to figure out how to proceed. But the man's voice broke the silence. Is that the man who's been causing all the trouble? He asked, his tone gruff but not unfriendly. He pointed a thumb over his shoulder, where Greg had just disappeared with Karen. Eli frowned, not understanding at first. What do you mean? The man didn't seem to care whether Eli responded or not. He marched right up to the counter, where Charles was still standing, his expression neutral. He's a jerk, that one, the man muttered, glancing toward the back of the store. Thinks he can treat anyone like dirt because he owns the place. But he's about to find out he's not the only one who can make things happen around here. Eli's heart skipped a beat. Could this be someone who could help him? Someone who was aware of what was going on in this store? Someone who had the power to make a difference? Before Eli could speak up, the man turned his attention to him, his sharp eyes scanning Eli's face. There was a glint of recognition in the older man's gaze, though Eli wasn't sure why. "Who are you?" the man asked, his voice taking on a more curious tone. "I don't think I've seen you around here before." Eli hesitated. He didn't want to give too much away. He had a mission, and revealing too much could complicate things. But there was something about the man's presence that made him feel he could trust him, if only for a moment. "I'm just someone trying to understand what's going on here," Eli said carefully. "I came in because I wanted to buy something, but I didn't expect to see what I saw." The man raised an eyebrow but didn't question him further. Instead, he gave a slight nod as though he understood more than he was letting on. "Well, don't expect any help from Greg. The man's got a reputation and it's not a good one," the older man said. "I've been coming here for years, and I've seen people get treated poorly just because they didn't fit Greg's idea of what's acceptable. It's why I stopped shopping here." Eli listened intently, his mind racing with possibilities. Could this man be a key ally? Or was he simply another person who had been wronged by Greg and was now bitter about it? There was no way to know for sure, but Eli couldn't afford to miss an opportunity. As the older man continued to speak, Eli's thoughts shifted back to Greg and his behavior. Greg had been so quick to dismiss him, so eager to show that he held the power. But now Eli realized that there was something more to Greg's attitude. Something deeper, something tied to the power dynamics of the store. The way he had switched from anger to charm when Karen entered wasn't just a show of professionalism. It was a clear indication of how Greg operated. He treated people based on what he thought they were worth. Eli's blood began to boil again. But he forced himself to focus. He had a plan. He had to keep his eye on the bigger picture, no matter how much he wanted to lash out at Greg and everything he stood for. "Maybe you're right," Eli said, his voice steady despite the storm of thoughts swirling inside his head. "Maybe it's time someone did something about it." The older man glanced at him, an appraising look in his eyes. "I don't know what you're thinking, but if you've got a plan, you'd better move fast. Greg's the type of man who doesn't like to be challenged. He'll find a way to get rid of you if he senses you're causing trouble." Eli nodded. He knew this. He had to be careful. But he couldn't back down. Not now. Not after everything he had seen. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Eli said quietly. "I just want to expose the truth. I want people to know what he's really like." The older man gave him a sharp look as though weighing his words. Then, with a nod, he turned and walked toward the door, leaving Eli standing alone with his thoughts. Charles watched the whole exchange silently, then gave Eli a small, almost imperceptible nod. "You're not the first person to come in here with good intentions," Charles said quietly. "But if you're serious about exposing Greg, you'll need more than just words. You'll need evidence. And you'll need people who are willing to back you up." Eli turned to Charles, his mind racing. "Do you think you could help me?" Charles hesitated for a moment, then sighed deeply. "I don't know. I've been working here for years and I've seen enough to know that Greg is dangerous. But if you're really going through with this, I won't stop you." Eli's heart raced. He was getting closer to the truth. But he also knew that things were about to get even more complicated. There were people in this store who were complicit in Greg's behavior. And if he wasn't careful, he could find himself in even more danger than he had anticipated. Before he could respond, the door swung open once again. Greg returned, his face red and filled with fury. But this time he wasn't alone. Greg's return wasn't just about anger, it was about something far more dangerous. His eyes scanned the store like a predator hunting its prey, his gaze flicking over Eli, Charles, and the rest of the customers. There was a coldness to him now, a sense that he had already made up his mind about what was going to happen next. "Charles," Greg said, his voice smooth but laced with venom, "I think we need to have a little chat. You've been stirring up some things around here that I don't appreciate." Charles remained still, his face unreadable, but Eli could see the subtle tightening of his jaw. It was clear he was trying to stay calm, but the tension was growing by the second. Eli knew that the situation was about to escalate, he could feel it in the air. "Greg," Charles replied evenly, "I don't know what you think is going on, but you're wrong. I'm just trying to help the customers." Greg sneered. "Help the customers? Is that what you think you're doing? Or are you just trying to stir up trouble? You're on thin ice here, my friend. Very thin ice." Eli stepped forward slightly, his voice steady despite the racing of his heart. "Maybe it's time someone spoke up. Maybe it's time people saw the truth about you, Greg." Greg's head snapped around to look at him, his eyes narrowing with sudden fury. "You think you can come into my store and talk to me like that?" His voice was low but the threat was clear. "I think you've been treating people terribly, Eli said, his tone unwavering. And I think it's time someone exposed you for what you really are. The words hung in the air, charged with the weight of the confrontation. Greg's expression twisted into a grimace, his fingers curling into fists at his sides. It was clear that he wasn't used to being challenged, especially not in his own store. But Eli was done holding back. I don't think you understand the situation, Amish man, Greg said, his voice dripping with contempt. This is my store. My business. And if you think you can come in here and make accusations, then you've got another thing coming. Charles stepped between them, trying to defuse the situation before it got out of hand. Greg, this isn't necessary. We can all calm down and talk this through. But Greg wasn't listening. He was too far gone, consumed by his anger. No, Charles. I've had enough of this, he snapped. I'm done playing nice. Greg turned his attention back to Eli, his eyes hardening with cold fury. You've got two choices, Amish man. You can leave this store right now and I'll pretend like none of this happened. Or I can make sure you never step foot in a place like this again. Ever. Eli could feel the pressure building, but he didn't back down. His mind was made up. He couldn't let Greg's behavior go unchallenged. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. I'm not leaving, Eli said firmly, his voice rising with determination. I'm not going anywhere until people know what you're really like. The words seemed to hit Greg like a slap to the face. He took a step forward, his chest puffing up as if to intimidate Eli, but it wasn't working. Eli held his ground, his eyes unwavering. Greg's hand shot out, grabbing Eli by the arm and yanking him toward the door. I said you're leaving now, he snarled, his grip like iron. But just as Greg tried to force Eli toward the door, the older man, who had been watching silently from the back of the store, moved quickly to intervene. That's enough, Greg, the man barked, his voice loud and authoritative. He stepped between Greg and Eli, his eyes filled with defiance. You don't get to treat people like this anymore. Greg froze for a moment, taken aback by the sudden challenge. The older man was not someone Greg had expected to stand up to him. But before Greg could respond, the man continued, his tone unyielding. I've seen enough. I've watched you push people around for far too long. And I won't stand by and let you do it to this man too. You've crossed the line, Greg. Greg's face twisted with rage, but the older man didn't back down. It was clear that Greg's usual tactics of intimidation weren't going to work on this person. The atmosphere in the store had shifted once again, this time with a sense of defiance growing in the air. Charles, who had been watching the exchange with a mix of concern and curiosity, now took a step forward as well. I think it's time we all had a serious conversation about how we're going to handle this. Eli felt the weight of the moment. He knew that things were changing. The balance of power in the store was shifting, and for the first time, Greg was no longer in control. Greg stood there, seething with anger, his fists clenched at his sides. He had never been challenged like this before, and he didn't know how to respond. His eyes flicked to the older man, then to Charles and finally back to Eli, but there was no way out. His pride had been wounded, and he knew that this moment would not end quietly. For the first time, Greg realized he had underestimated the power of the people he thought he could control. The situation was slipping out of his grasp, and he knew it. But just as Greg opened his mouth to respond, the door swung open once again. This time it was the police. What will happen now? Will the authorities intervene, or is this just the beginning of something bigger? Eli's resolve is stronger than ever, but what will it cost him? The story is about to take another unexpected turn. The sound of the door opening again was sharp and unsettling, and Eli's heart skipped a beat as he turned toward the entrance. There, standing in the doorway, were two police officers. Their uniforms were crisp, and their expressions unreadable, but the tension in the air was palpable. The room went silent as everyone turned to face the new arrivals, and Eli could see the way Greg's eyes narrowed with a mixture of fear and frustration. Good afternoon, officers, Greg said, forcing a smile, though his voice betrayed the thinness of his composure. How can I help you? The officer who seemed to be in charge, a tall woman with dark hair tied back into a neat bun, didn't return the smile. We received a call about a disturbance in this store. Something about a customer being mistreated? Greg stiffened. Mistreated? I don't know what you're talking about. Everything is under control here. His gaze flicked nervously toward Eli, then back to the officers. The second officer, a younger man with a stubbled chin, crossed his arms, clearly skeptical. We were told there was some kind of confrontation going on. We just want to make sure everything's all right. Eli, who had been standing silently at the center of the drama, finally spoke up. I was the one who called. I'm the one being mistreated. The officers turned their attention to him and Greg's face turned pale. He hadn't expected this. The calm confidence that he had worn moments ago seemed to drain from him, leaving only an angry, desperate man. I've been treated unfairly just because of how I look. The owner here, Greg Thompson, has been insulting me and trying to throw me out, Eli said, his voice steady but his heart racing. This was it. This was the moment where everything would either change or shatter. The officers exchanged a quick glance and then the woman spoke. We'll need you to step outside and tell us exactly what happened. Greg opened his mouth to protest, but the woman officer held up a hand. I suggest you stay quiet for now. We'll need to hear from everyone involved. Eli felt a strange sense of relief as he stepped toward the door, followed by the officers. His chest felt tight, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like something was finally being done about the injustice he had experienced. But he also knew that Greg wasn't the type to back down easily. This confrontation was far from over. Once outside, the officers motioned for Eli to sit on a nearby bench, while they asked him to explain everything in detail. Eli took a deep breath, recounting the entire incident from the moment he had walked into the store. He told them about Greg's rude dismissal, the insults, and how he had been humiliated simply for being Amish. As he spoke, the officers listened carefully, nodding along, taking notes. When Eli finished, the female officer stood up and turned toward Greg, who was still inside the store, glaring at the scene unfolding. The officers spoke in hushed tones for a moment, and then the male officer turned to Eli. We've got everything we need. We'll be filing a report and checking the store's security cameras for any footage of what happened inside. Greg stepped out of the store just as the officers were finishing their conversation. His eyes flicked nervously from one officer to the other, then to Eli. He looked like a man who was cornered, a man who realized he couldn't get out of this mess easily. You think you've won? Greg spat, his voice low and venomous. You think you can just call the cops and make everything go away? You have no idea what you've started. Eli stood his ground, his voice calm but firm. What I've started is the truth. And you can't hide from that. The officers took one last look at Greg, then turned back to Eli. We'll take it from here. Thank you for your cooperation, sir. If anything else comes up, we'll contact you. With that, the officers walked toward their patrol car and Greg stood there, fuming with rage. The world around him seemed to grow quieter, as though the entire store was holding its breath, waiting to see how he would react. Greg's eyes flicked toward Charles, who was standing nearby, watching the scene unfold with an unreadable expression. He could tell that Greg was about to lose his composure completely. Don't think this is over, Charles, Greg growled, his voice low and threatening. You've made a mistake by siding with him. And you're going to regret it. Charles didn't flinch. I've seen enough. You're the one who's going to regret this. Greg clenched his fists and turned away, marching back into the store without another word. The moment he disappeared inside, the tension seemed to break. Eli let out a long breath, his heart still racing, but the weight of the situation hadn't fully lifted. Charles walked up to him, his expression softening. You did good, he said quietly. But I don't know how long you'll be able to keep this up. Greg won't take this lying down. Eli nodded, knowing that the road ahead was going to be long and difficult. I don't care. I'm not backing down. Not now. Charles gave him a thoughtful look. I hope you're ready for what's coming. Greg's not the kind of guy who gives up easily. Eli looked back at the store where the door had slammed shut. I'm ready, he said, his voice steady. This is only the beginning. As the scene settled, Eli knew that things were about to get even more complicated. Greg wasn't going to just let this go. He had made powerful enemies now, and those enemies didn't like to lose. But the question remained, what would Greg do next? The game had changed. But would Eli's efforts bring about the justice he hoped for, or would they spark something even darker? The answer was unclear, but one thing was certain. Eli wasn't about to back down. The day after the police left the luxury store, Eli couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. He had stood up for what was right, and for the first time someone had listened. But that small victory seemed fragile, and he couldn't help but wonder if it was enough to bring about the change he wanted. He spent the rest of the afternoon walking around town, trying to clear his head. His steps echoed in the empty streets, and the cool breeze did little to calm his racing thoughts. What would happen to Greg now? Was he going to face consequences for his actions, or was he powerful enough to avoid them? But Eli couldn't dwell on the uncertainty for long. His resolve had been solidified. He was doing this for more than just himself. He was doing it for everyone Greg had ever treated like garbage. His actions might just be the spark that started a fire of change in the community. As the evening drew closer, Eli returned to the farm. His family, oblivious to the events that had unfolded, went about their evening chores. Eli quietly went inside, feeling the weight of the day's events settle heavily on his shoulders. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep going like this. But he knew he had no choice. His thoughts were interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Eli's heart skipped a beat as he quickly opened it. Standing there was the older man from the store, the one who had intervened when Greg tried to throw him out. His name was Daniel, and Eli had been wondering what his role in all this was. "Evening," Daniel said with a nod. "I thought we might talk for a minute." Eli stepped aside, allowing Daniel to enter. "Of course. What's going on?" Daniel didn't waste any time. He sat down at the table and leaned forward, his expression serious. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened yesterday," he began. "I know you're in this for the right reasons, but I also know that Greg is a dangerous man. He has connections. If you keep going down this path, you could make things worse for yourself." Eli felt a pang of unease in his stomach. "What do you mean by worse?" "I thought I was doing the right thing." Daniel sighed. "You are, but Greg doesn't just own that store. He's got a lot of influence. He's tied up with people who won't hesitate to hurt someone who stands in their way." Eli's mind raced. He had been so focused on exposing Greg's racism that he hadn't fully considered the depth of the man's power. The realization was unsettling, but it didn't make him want to back down. "I'm not afraid of him," Eli said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "He can threaten me all he wants, but that won't stop me from doing what's right." Daniel studied him for a long moment, then leaned back in his chair. "You're brave. I'll give you that. But sometimes bravery isn't enough. You're not just taking on one man. You're taking on a whole system. And that's something you need to understand before it's too late." Eli's thoughts swirled. Was he really ready for what lay ahead? He had thought exposing Greg's behavior would be enough, but now Daniel's words hung in the air, heavy with warning. Was he truly prepared to deal with the consequences of challenging Greg? "I don't want to back down," Eli said quietly, his voice firm. "I've seen too much. I can't just walk away now." Daniel nodded slowly. "I understand. But you're going to need help. People who are willing to stand by you. People who have the power to make sure Greg's not the only one with a voice." Eli's heart skipped a beat. "What are you suggesting?" "I've been in this town long enough to know who has influence," Daniel said. "There are people who want things to change. People who don't like the way Greg runs his business. If you can convince them to speak out, it might be the push you need to make things right." Eli felt a spark of hope. Maybe he wasn't alone in this after all. "Who are they?" Daniel leaned forward again, his voice lowering to a whisper. "I've got a few names in mind. But you've got to be careful. You don't know who Greg has working behind the scenes. If you're not careful, you could find yourself in over your head." Eli nodded, understanding the weight of Daniel's words. The stakes had just gotten higher, and he couldn't afford to be careless. But at the same time, he felt a sense of purpose burning in his chest. If he could gather support, if he could unite people who had been too afraid to speak up, then maybe, just maybe, he could bring down the empire Greg had built. "I'm in," Eli said with a determination he hadn't felt before. "I'll do whatever it takes to get the truth out." Daniel's face softened slightly, and for the first time, Eli saw a glimpse of approval in his eyes. "Good. But remember, don't underestimate what you're up against." As Daniel left, Eli stood at the door, watching the man disappear into the night. His mind was spinning with the possibilities. This was no longer just about one man's cruelty, it was about a system of injustice that reached far beyond the walls of that luxury store. And Eli was about to expose it all. The next day he set out to meet the people Daniel had mentioned. He didn't know exactly who they were or if they would be willing to help him, but he had to try. With every step, the weight of what he was about to do grew heavier, but he knew there was no turning back. The first person on his list was a woman named Rebecca. She worked as a lawyer in the town, and Daniel had told Eli that she had a reputation for fighting for the underdog. Eli hoped she would be willing to take up his cause. When Eli knocked on Rebecca's door, his nerves were on edge. He hadn't told anyone about his plan to take down Greg, no one except Daniel. But this was the moment of truth. Would Rebecca stand by him? The door creaked open, and there she was, a woman in her mid-30s dressed simply in a sweater and jeans. She looked at Eli with a mixture of curiosity and caution, but there was something in her eyes that made Eli feel like maybe, just maybe, she would listen. "Can I help you?" Rebecca asked, her voice warm but guarded. "I hope so," Eli said, stepping forward. "I need your help with something important. It's about Greg Thompson." The stakes were rising. Would Rebecca agree to help, or would Eli find himself facing another setback? And what would Greg do in response to this growing movement against him? The next chapter is set to take the story to the next level, where the fight for justice becomes even more dangerous. Rebecca didn't hesitate for long. She looked Eli up and down, her expression thoughtful, before she stepped aside to let him in. The door clicked shut behind him and Eli felt a sense of relief. He had made it this far. Now it was time to see if his plan could truly come together. They sat at her kitchen table, a cup of tea in front of each of them. The warm light from the overhead lamp cast soft shadows on the walls, creating an oddly peaceful atmosphere. But inside Eli's chest, his heart was pounding, unsure of what Rebecca's answer would be. "Greg Thompson is a dangerous man," Rebecca said, leaning forward slightly. "I've heard about him, seen the way he runs his store. But I've never had proof that he's done anything illegal." Eli nodded, understanding. He had known from the start that this wasn't going to be easy. Exposing Greg's behavior wasn't just about telling people what he had done, it was about gathering hard evidence that would prove everything. "I've seen it. The way he treats people, the way he discriminates against those he thinks are beneath him. It's more than just rude behavior. He's exploiting people. And I've had enough." Rebecca studied him for a long moment. "I've fought for justice before," she said slowly. "But this is going to take more than just a few good words. You're going up against a man who has a lot of money and power behind him. He's not going to let this go easily." Eli leaned forward, his voice quiet but determined. "I don't care about how much power he has. I care about doing what's right. If we don't stand up to him, then no one will." Rebecca's eyes softened, and for the first time, Eli saw a flicker of something deeper, sympathy maybe, or understanding. "You're right," she said quietly. "And I'm in. But we need to be smart about this. You're not just challenging Greg, you're challenging a whole system. We need to gather evidence. And we need to make sure we have people who can back us up. People who won't be afraid to stand with us when the time comes." Eli exhaled slowly, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. This was the first step. He had Rebecca's support and that meant everything. She was the key to building the foundation he needed to expose Greg. But he knew it wasn't going to be easy. Nothing worth fighting for ever was. "Do you know anyone else who might help?" Eli asked, his mind already racing to the next phase. Rebecca nodded. "I have a few contacts who might be able to help. But like I said, we have to be careful. Greg has connections in this town, people who would do anything to protect him. If we push too hard, we could find ourselves in real trouble." Eli understood. He had already seen the dangerous side of Greg's power. The last thing he wanted was to put himself, or anyone else, in harm's way. But it seemed like that was the risk he had to take if he wanted to make a real change. "We'll be careful," Eli promised. "But we can't wait too long. If we give him more time, he'll just keep hurting people. He'll keep using his power to control everything." Rebecca nodded in agreement. "Agreed. But we'll need a strategy. This isn't something we can rush into." They spent the next hour discussing their plans, mapping out the steps they would take. They talked about gathering testimonies from other customers who had been mistreated, finding any footage of Greg's behavior that could back up their claims, and contacting others who might have witnessed his actions. It was a lot to take in, but Eli felt more confident with each passing moment. This wasn't just his fight anymore, it was something bigger. As the conversation wrapped up, Eli stood to leave. "Thank you," he said, his voice sincere. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Rebecca smiled faintly. "Don't thank me yet. This is just the beginning. We've got a long road ahead." Eli nodded, feeling the weight of the battle ahead, but also the spark of hope that had started to grow inside him. This was far from over, but with Rebecca's help, he was one step closer to bringing Greg down. As Eli left the house and walked back into the cool evening air, he couldn't help but wonder what Greg was doing right now. Was he making plans of his own? Was he already trying to cover his tracks? Eli knew he had to move quickly. Greg wasn't the type to go down without a fight. But the more Eli thought about it, the more he realized that he couldn't do this alone. He needed allies, people who were willing to put everything on the line to see this through. He was determined to reach out to more people, to gather support from anyone who had been wronged by Greg or who believed in what Eli was fighting for. But he also knew that each move had to be calculated. One wrong step and Greg's power could destroy everything. The next morning, Eli set out to visit more people. His friends, his neighbors, anyone who might be willing to help. He knew he had to be strategic, but he also knew that every new ally would bring him closer to his goal. And with Rebecca's help, he felt like he was finally on the right path. As the day wore on, Eli felt a growing sense of urgency. Greg wouldn't wait long to strike back. But Eli was determined. He wasn't backing down. By the time he reached the last person on his list, a man named Caleb who had worked at the store in the past and had witnessed Greg's behavior firsthand, Eli could feel the pieces of the puzzle starting to come together. But just as he was about to knock on Caleb's door, Eli heard a familiar voice behind him. "Eli, we need to talk." Eli turned to see Daniel standing behind him, his face serious, his eyes narrowed with concern. What was Daniel about to say? Was it another warning or was something bigger happening? The story was about to take a dramatic turn, and Eli had no idea what was coming next. Eli turned to face Daniel, his stomach twisting with uncertainty. The older man's face was tense, and there was an urgency in his eyes that made Eli's heart race. It was clear that something had changed, something was coming. "What's going on?" Eli asked, his voice low, as if speaking any louder might make the situation worse. Daniel glanced around, making sure no one was watching before he spoke. "We don't have much time. Greg knows you're coming after him." Eli's heart skipped a beat. "How do you know that?" Daniel stepped closer, lowering his voice even further. "He has eyes everywhere. You think he's just going to let you gather support without retaliating? He's already starting to make moves. I've been hearing rumors. He's not sitting back and waiting for you to expose him. He's planning his counterattack." Eli's mind raced. He had known that Greg wouldn't take this lying down, but the speed with which things were escalating caught him off guard. "What do you mean? What's he planning?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a deep breath, his gaze flicking nervously to the street behind them. "I don't know the full extent yet. But I do know this: Greg is not afraid to use his power to crush anyone who stands in his way. And he has resources. People who will do whatever it takes to protect him." Eli's blood ran cold. He had expected resistance, of course, but not like this. He wasn't just up against a cruel businessman. He was up against someone with a network of influence, people who were ready to act at a moment's notice. "What do we do now?" Eli asked, his voice tight. "I can't just stop. We've come too far." Daniel nodded, his expression grave. "You're right. We can't stop now. But you need to be careful. Greg's retaliation is going to be more than just a few threats. I think he's going to make an example of someone." Eli's mind raced. "What do you mean, make an example of someone?" Daniel hesitated, but then his face hardened. "I think he's going to target one of your allies. Someone you trust. That's how he works. He finds the weak link and exploits it. It's how he maintains control." Eli felt his blood run cold at the thought. He had worked so hard to build a network of people who would stand with him. He had already started to gather evidence, speak to witnesses, and contact people who could help expose Greg. But if Greg went after one of them? Who? Eli asked urgently. "Who's he going to target?" "I don't know for sure," Daniel said, shaking his head. "But I've heard whispers that he's planning something big. He's going to use whatever leverage he has to destroy anyone who stands in his way. And that includes you." Eli's mind flashed to the people he had been talking to: Rebecca, Caleb, Charles, and the others. Who would Greg choose? Who would he try to break first? "We need to warn them," Eli said, his voice shaking with the weight of the situation. "We can't just sit back and wait for him to make a move." Daniel nodded. "I'll do what I can to spread the word. But you need to be careful too. Keep your distance. Don't let Greg know you're on to him." Eli felt a sense of dread wash over him. He had been so focused on taking Greg down that he hadn't fully considered the danger to his friends. It was one thing to stand up to Greg alone, but now that he had allies, the stakes had gotten much higher. "Do you think we can stop him?" Eli asked, his voice low. Daniel gave him a hard look. "We can try. But you need to be prepared for what might happen next. If Greg decides to go after your people, it's going to be a fight like nothing you've ever seen." Eli stood in silence, trying to digest everything Daniel had said. It felt like the walls were closing in around him. He had started this fight with the intention of exposing one man's cruelty. But now it was clear that Greg was a far bigger threat than he had ever imagined. And Eli wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. He was fighting for his life, and the lives of everyone he had come to rely on. "We can't give up," Eli said, his voice firm with resolve. "We can't let him win." Daniel studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "You're right. But you need to be ready for the storm that's coming. Things are about to get a lot harder." Eli knew Daniel was right. Greg wasn't going to sit idly by. He was going to make sure Eli and his allies paid for the challenge they posed. And Eli couldn't afford to lose anyone, not now, not when they were so close. "I'll make sure everyone knows what's coming," Eli said. "We need to stay one step ahead." Daniel gave a tight-lipped smile. Good luck, Eli. You'll need it. As Eli made his way home, his thoughts were a whirlwind of strategy and uncertainty. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking a tightrope, one wrong move away from disaster. But he also knew one thing: he couldn't back down. The fight for justice was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. The next morning Eli woke up early. He couldn't afford to wait any longer. Greg was preparing his counterattack and Eli had to be ready. He quickly made plans to meet with his allies: Rebecca, Caleb, Charles, anyone who could help him gather more evidence, anyone who could offer support. But just as he was about to leave, he got a call. It was from Charles. Eli, Charles's voice was filled with panic. You need to get to the store. No. Greg knows. He's making his move. Eli's pulse quickened. Was it too late to stop what was happening? What was Greg planning now? The story was taking another dark turn, and Eli had no idea what was about to hit him. Eli's heart raced as he hung up the phone. Charles's voice had been filled with urgency. He was in trouble, and it sounded like time was running out. Greg had made his move, and Eli needed to act fast. Without thinking, Eli grabbed his jacket and bolted out the door, his footsteps echoing down the quiet street as he hurried toward the luxury store. His mind was spinning. What did Greg know? Had he discovered their plans? Was this the moment when everything would collapse? As Eli walked quickly through the town, his thoughts were a blur. He knew Greg had connections, powerful ones. The whispers Daniel had shared with him echoed in his ears. Greg wasn't just a businessman. He had influence, and he wouldn't hesitate to use it to protect himself. Eli pushed himself harder, ignoring the aching in his legs. He had to get to Charles before it was too late. When Eli finally reached the store, he could see the commotion from a block away. There were police cars parked outside, their lights flashing in the early morning haze. His stomach dropped. Had Greg escalated things that far? He rushed forward, his eyes scanning the scene, searching for Charles. Then he saw him, standing near the door, speaking urgently to two officers. His expression was tense, his body rigid with concern. Eli didn't waste any time. He rushed over to Charles. "What's happening?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper as he approached. "What did Greg do?" Charles turned toward him, his face tight with fear. "It's bad, Eli. Greg's got people in the police. He's using his connections to get rid of anyone who challenges him. He's been spreading rumors about you, about us. He's telling people we're causing trouble, that we're threatening him." Eli's mind raced. What does that mean? What are they doing? Charles shook his head, frustration and fear written all over his face. "They've been trying to intimidate us. Some of the people who've been helping you are being harassed, and I think Greg's trying to find out who's backing you. He knows you've been talking to people. He's going to do everything he can to make sure this doesn't go any further." Eli clenched his fists, trying to hold back his anger. He had known Greg would fight back, but this was more than he had imagined. "We can't let him scare us," Eli said, his voice steady. "We have to keep going. We need to expose what he's doing." Charles looked at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of respect and concern. "I don't know if it's that simple anymore. He's got the law on his side. If we push too hard, we could end up in real trouble." Eli didn't flinch. "We don't have a choice. We can't back down now." Just then one of the officers approached, a stern look on his face. "Are you the one causing all this trouble?" he asked, his voice cold. Eli's stomach turned. This was it. Greg's retaliation had already begun. But he couldn't show weakness now. He couldn't let Greg or anyone else see that they had shaken him. "I'm not causing trouble," Eli said firmly. "I'm standing up for what's right. I'm not afraid of Greg or anyone else." The officer's expression didn't change, but he glanced at the other officers, then back at Eli. "You need to leave. No. We've had enough of this. If you don't, we'll be forced to take action." Eli's heart pounded in his chest. They were trying to intimidate him, just like Greg had done to so many others. He took a deep breath, his body stiff with tension. "We're not going anywhere," Charles said, stepping forward. "We've done nothing wrong." The officer didn't respond immediately, but his gaze grew colder. "That's what they all say," he muttered, turning and walking back to his patrol car. Eli watched him go, the weight of the situation settling over him like a dark cloud. Greg's influence had stretched this far, and it was clear that the battle was only going to get worse. "We need to take action," Eli said, his voice low. "We need to gather everything we've got. Testimonies, proof, whatever we can find. We have to expose him before he can destroy everything." Charles nodded. "You're right. But we need to be careful. Greg's making moves. If we're not smart, we'll end up just like the people he's already silenced. Eli didn't have time to answer. His thoughts were already racing, trying to plan their next steps. But the road ahead was growing darker, and Eli felt a cold sense of dread settle in his chest. What if they weren't strong enough? What if Greg's power was too great to defeat? Before he could continue his thoughts, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Eli pulled it out and checked the message. It was from Rebecca. Eli, I just heard. Greg is going after people who've spoken up. I think he knows who's been helping you. We need to be careful. He's got eyes everywhere. Please stay safe. Eli's fingers tightened around the phone. It was exactly what he had feared. Greg was making his move. The people who had stood by him were in danger now, and he had to act fast. We need to meet with Rebecca, Eli said urgently. And we need to get the others. Now. Charles didn't hesitate. Let's go. The longer we wait, the worse it will get. As they walked quickly down the street, Eli's mind raced with plans and counterplans. Greg wasn't going to give up easily, and Eli knew that the more they pushed, the more dangerous things would become. But if they didn't expose Greg now, it would only get worse for everyone who had suffered under his control. And just as they reached the corner, Eli stopped dead in his tracks. There, standing across the street, was Greg. His eyes locked onto Eli's with a cold, calculating gaze. Eli's breath caught in his throat. Was this it? Was Greg making his final move? The tension had reached its peak. What would Greg do now that he had Eli in his sights? Would this be the moment everything unraveled, or was Eli walking right into Greg's trap? The sight of Greg standing across the street, his cold, calculating eyes locked onto Eli, sent a chill down his spine. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The bustling town around them disappeared, and the weight of the situation became unbearable. It was just Greg, Eli, and the tension hanging thick in the air. Greg didn't move. He didn't need to. The look on his face said everything. He knew exactly what Eli was trying to do, and he wasn't going to let it happen. Eli's heart pounded in his chest as he felt the urgency of the moment. He could turn around, run back to safety, or he could face Greg head-on and continue the fight. His eyes flicked to Charles, who was standing next to him, just as tense but equally determined. "We have to keep moving," Eli muttered under his breath. Charles nodded, his eyes darting toward the other officers still gathered by the store. They hadn't noticed Greg yet, but that didn't mean Greg hadn't planned for this moment. Eli wasn't sure what Greg had in mind, but he knew one thing. Greg had never been this close to him before. Now it was time to make a choice. Eli took a deep breath and stepped forward, crossing the street with a sense of purpose. Every step felt heavier, like the weight of the world was on his shoulders. Charles followed silently, and the two of them walked toward Greg, who had yet to break eye contact. As they neared, Greg's lips curled into a smirk, a look of superiority that made Eli's blood boil. Well, if it isn't the hero of the hour," Greg said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Eli didn't flinch. He could feel the eyes of the town on him, could sense the tension rising in the air. This was it. There was no turning back. "What do you want, Greg?" Eli asked, his voice steady but filled with anger. Greg took a slow step toward him, his tall frame casting a shadow over Eli. "I want you to understand something, Eli. You've been a problem. But more importantly, you've been a threat to everything I've worked for. You think you can just waltz in here and take me down, but you've underestimated me." Eli clenched his fists, but he stood his ground. "You've been hurting people. You've been taking advantage of your power and using it to hurt those who can't fight back. I'm not the one who's wrong here. It's you." Greg's smirk faltered just for a moment before it returned with even more venom. "You really think you're going to change anything? Do you think the people here care about what you've done? They don't care about you, Eli. They don't care about your cause. They care about their businesses, their safety, their comfort. And when it comes down to it, they'll side with me, not you." Eli's anger flared, but he forced himself to stay calm. "You're wrong, Greg. The truth will come out. People will stand up for what's right. And when that happens, you'll have no power left." Greg let out a harsh laugh, his voice full of disdain. "The truth? You think your little crusade will change anything? Let me show you how much power I have." Without warning, Greg's phone buzzed in his hand. He glanced at it, his expression tightening as he read the message. Eli could see the shift in Greg's demeanor. This was something big. Something that would change everything. Greg looked back up at Eli, his face now hard with an unreadable expression. "You should be careful, Eli," he said in a low, menacing tone. "I've just made a call, and you'll soon learn that this isn't just a battle you're fighting anymore. This is war." With that, Greg turned and started walking toward the store, his footsteps heavy. As he reached the door, he paused and looked back over his shoulder at Eli, a final smirk playing on his lips. Enjoy the last few moments of your fight. They'll be the best part of your story. Eli stood there for a long moment, trying to process everything that had just happened. He had been so sure of his path, so convinced that Greg was on the verge of being exposed. But now it felt like the ground beneath him was crumbling. What was that about? Charles asked, his voice low, his eyes scanning the area to make sure no one else was watching. I don't know, Eli said, his voice tight with confusion. But it doesn't feel good. He's not backing down. He's planning something. Charles nodded slowly. We need to be careful. He's got connections, and if he's playing dirty, it could be worse than we thought. Eli's mind was racing. He had no idea what Greg was planning, but it didn't matter. He couldn't let fear control him. He couldn't stop now. He had come too far, and too many people were counting on him to give up. We need to gather everyone. We need to get the truth out, no matter what it takes, Eli said, his voice firm with resolve. Charles looked at him, a flicker of concern in his eyes, but he didn't argue. All right. Let's do this. But we need a plan. Greg's already made his move. We need to be ready for what comes next. As Eli turned away and walked back down the street, his mind was set. He knew Greg wasn't going to back down. But neither was he. The battle was far from over. And this time, Eli wasn't going to stop until Greg had nowhere left to hide. But as he reached the corner, Eli's phone buzzed again. It was another message from Rebecca. Eli, be careful. I've just heard. Greg is pulling strings and the people he's going after aren't safe. We need to move fast. Let's meet up. Eli's stomach sank. This wasn't just a fight for justice anymore. It was a fight for survival. What was Greg planning? Was Eli walking into a trap, or was he finally on the verge of exposing the truth? With danger closing in, Eli's resolve was stronger than ever, but was it enough to withstand the storm Greg had unleashed?